I had missed the last bus. It was the first time in my life that I had stayed out late enough for that to happen, but when I glanced at my watch and saw the time, panic set in. My phone had died hours ago, and the city had long since slipped into an eerie silence, with only the hum of distant traffic to break the stillness. The streetlights flickered above me, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. I was alone. I could feel the weight of the night pressing down on me, a creeping tension building in my chest. Normally, I would have walked the few blocks back to my apartment, but tonight felt different. The streets seemed unnaturally quiet, as though the world was holding its breath. I stood at the bus stop, my mind racing. I had a cab app on my phone, but without battery, I was stranded. The thought of walking alone at this hour unsettled me. A small shiver ran down my spine, not from the cold, but from the awareness that something wasn't quite right. That's when I saw it. A bus, an old one, appeared in the distance, its headlights slicing through the fog that had suddenly rolled in. The bus didn't stop at the usual station down the block. It slowed as it neared me, and the door creaked open with a noise that made my skin crawl. My first instinct was to turn around and walk away, but something made me freeze. I looked up at the sign above the door. There was no route number, no destination displayed. Just a dim, flickering light that seemed to glow too brightly for the night. The door opened further, and I could see the driver's face, if you could call it that, shadowed, yet unsettlingly still. His eyes were hidden behind dark glasses, and his hands, pale and unnervingly calm, gripped the wheel without a twitch. He didn't speak, didn't gesture for me to get on. But the door was open, and the bus was waiting. Without thinking, I stepped on. There was no turning back now. As I stepped inside, a thick, stale air hit me, too still, too stagnant. I could hear the muffled hum of the engine as it revved quietly, its vibrations crawling under my skin. The interior was dimly lit, the fluorescent lights casting a sickly yellow glow that made everything look washed out and distant. There was a strange odor that clung to the air, like old leather mixed with something metallic and unpleasant. I found an empty seat near the back, not sure why, but feeling compelled to sit far from the driver. The instant I sat down, I realized something was wrong. There were other passengers. They were sitting silently in the seats, their eyes staring ahead, unblinking, unmoving. None of them looked at me when I entered. They just stared at the empty road ahead, their expressions vacant. I was the only one who wasn't motionless. My heart raced as I looked around. Every single one of them was staring in the same direction, sitting perfectly still, as if frozen in time. The woman across from me had a gaunt face, her skin an unnatural shade of pale under the flickering lights. Her hair was pulled back tightly, her eyes sunken and dark. I could almost feel the weight of her gaze, even though she wasn't looking at me. I shivered, trying to shake off the growing unease. Maybe it was just the lateness of the hour. Maybe it was just fatigue playing tricks on me. I leaned forward, trying to peer past the rows of silent passengers, but the driver's head was still turned down, hidden in shadows. He had not moved. I looked at my watch, 9:53 p.m. It was strange. The bus had only just arrived, but the streets outside were empty. We hadn't passed a single other vehicle, no sign of life beyond the faint glow of streetlights. I shifted in my seat, my pulse quickening. The silence of the bus was suffocating. It pressed against me, heavier than I could bear. It was as if the world outside had faded entirely, leaving only the rhythmic hum of the engine and the odd, steady pulse of light flickering above. "Excuse me," I muttered, glancing toward the driver, but the words felt small and unnecessary, swallowed by the silence. No response came. I looked around again. The other passengers hadn't moved. Then, a strange thing happened. I noticed that the woman across from me, the one with the pale face, was holding something in her hands. A small, folded piece of paper. She had been holding it the entire time, her fingers wrapped tightly around it, knuckles white. My heart skipped. I leaned in, trying to get a better look at the paper. I couldn't see what it was, but I was sure it hadn't been there when I first sat down. And then, just as quickly as I'd noticed it, her hand moved. Slowly, deliberately, her fingers began to unfurl, releasing the paper onto the seat beside her. My breath caught in my throat. The paper was covered in strange, jagged symbols. They looked like some sort of ancient writing, but I didn't recognize any of them. The ink was a deep crimson, almost too vivid against the yellow light of the bus. The symbols seemed to shift and move, even though I knew they shouldn't have. My stomach churned. I had to get off. I couldn't stay here. This place, this bus, wasn't normal. I stood up, my legs shaky, and began to move toward the front. But just as I reached the aisle, a hand caught my wrist. I froze. It wasn't the woman from before. No, it was another man, one I hadn't noticed before, sitting near the back. His face was pale, almost ghostly, his eyes wide and unblinking as they fixed on me. His grip was firm, cold. "Sit down," he said, his voice low and raspy, like it hadn't been used in years. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. The bus didn't feel like a vehicle anymore. It felt like something much darker, a cage. The passengers had become shadows, trapped in time. And I was just another soul, waiting for something to happen. But what? The man let go of my wrist, his expression unreadable, and once again, I was left in silence. I stumbled back to my seat, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to find a way out. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that maybe there was no way out at all. The bus moved forward into the dark, and the passengers, silent as always, continued to stare. The world outside was a blur of shadows and distant lights as the bus rolled on. I stared out the window, trying to focus on something, anything that would help make sense of the bizarre situation I was in. But there was nothing. Just an endless stretch of empty streets and dark buildings that seemed to swallow up any trace of life. I looked around again, hoping for some sign of normalcy, but it was the same as before. The passengers, those hollow-eyed, unblinking figures, sat in perfect stillness, as if the whole world had forgotten them. Their faces, pale and drained of color, seemed to merge into the dim lights of the bus, blending with the shadows that surrounded us. And the driver, he still hadn't moved. His hands were gripped tightly on the wheel, but his eyes never lifted from the dark road ahead. He was a part of the silence, a part of this strange, oppressive atmosphere. A part of something wrong. The unsettling feeling in my stomach grew stronger, the urge to escape building with every passing second. But where could I go? How could I leave when there was no destination? The city had disappeared behind us, swallowed by the night, leaving no signs of life beyond the fog pressing against the windows. It was as if the world outside no longer existed. My gaze fell back on the woman with the pale face, the one who had been holding the strange paper. Her eyes were fixed straight ahead, her lips thin and pressed together as though she were in some kind of trance. I couldn't shake the feeling that she had been watching me, even though her eyes were locked in the same empty stare as the others. And yet, when I looked down at the seat beside her, the paper was gone. Gone. I sat frozen, trying to comprehend what had just happened. There was no way she could have moved it without me seeing. But it was gone. And in its place, the faintest trace of something on the seat, something darker than shadow, began to spread out like ink bleeding into water. I couldn't look away. The dark stain seemed to stretch and pull, curling around the edges of the seat, spreading out further and further until it reached the aisle. My heart thudded in my chest. Something wasn't right. Something was wrong with this bus, with these people, with everything. And I could feel it creeping closer with every passing moment. I needed answers. I needed to know what was going on. I wasn't just going to sit here and wait for whatever was happening to unfold. I had to find out what the hell was happening to me. I pushed myself up from my seat and started toward the front of the bus, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The feeling of being trapped, of being suffocated, pressed down on me from all sides. As I moved toward the driver, the air seemed to grow thicker, heavier. It was harder to breathe, as if the very air had changed, become more oppressive. Every step I took made the darkness inside me grow larger, louder. A voice inside my head screamed for me to turn around, to sit back down, to pretend like none of this was real. But I couldn't. Not anymore. I reached the front of the bus, my hands trembling as I gripped the metal pole to steady myself. The driver remained as motionless as ever, his face still hidden in shadows. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next. I glanced over my shoulder. The other passengers hadn't moved. They were still staring ahead, their faces pale and expressionless. I felt their eyes on me, though none of them made a sound. The silence in the bus seemed to echo, amplifying the anxiety twisting in my gut. I cleared my throat, my voice hoarse from disuse. "Excuse me," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Where are we going?" The driver didn't answer. He didn't even move. I swallowed hard, the cold sweat gathering on my skin. My eyes darted to the window, but I couldn't see anything through the fog that had begun to collect outside. It was as if we were driving through an endless void, with no end in sight. "Please," I said louder this time, my voice shaking. "Can you tell me where we're going?" There was still no response. My pulse quickened, and I took a step closer to the driver, leaning over the seat. My heart was pounding in my chest, a deafening thrum that drowned out the stillness of the bus. I had to get answers. I had to know why this was happening. Just as I was about to reach out and touch the driver's shoulder, something shifted in the corner of my vision. I turned my head sharply to the side, my breath catching in my throat. The woman with the pale face, the one I had seen earlier, was staring at me now. Her eyes weren't vacant anymore. They were full of something I couldn't quite place. Fear. Pure, unadulterated fear. And then she opened her mouth. But no sound came out. Her lips moved, but the silence in the bus swallowed every word. I stumbled back, my heart racing as a cold chill spread through my body. What was happening? Why was she looking at me like that? Then, slowly, very slowly, she stood up. The entire bus seemed to hold its breath, the stillness intensifying. The other passengers, those lifeless, soulless figures, turned their heads in unison. All eyes were now on me. The woman reached toward me, her hand outstretched, her fingers trembling as they got closer. The fear in her eyes was palpable, and I could feel her desperation radiating off her like a wave. I took a step back, my throat tight, but I couldn't move fast enough. Her hand was almost upon me when the bus jerked to a sudden halt. The force of it threw me against the back of the seat in front of me, knocking the wind out of me. I gasped for breath, my mind reeling from the sudden shock. What was happening? Why had the bus stopped? The woman's hand froze in mid-air, just inches from my face. Silence. And then, with a low, almost imperceptible growl, the bus lurched forward again, its engine roaring to life. I looked around. The passengers, the woman, the man, everyone had returned to their seats, their eyes once again fixed ahead, unblinking. I stood there, my body trembling, the sound of my heartbeat deafening in my ears. I didn't understand. None of this made sense. I thought I had seen something real, something terrifying. But now, everything was as it had been before. The bus continued on, rolling through the thick fog, and I could do nothing but sit there, helpless, as it carried me further into the unknown. What was this place? What had I gotten myself into? I didn't know. But I could feel the darkness growing closer. And I could feel it calling to me. Something was waiting for me. I had thought I would find answers. I had believed that somehow, if I kept my eyes open, kept pushing forward, I would uncover the truth behind this never-ending ride. But as the bus moved through the thickening fog, I realized that what I had been chasing, what I had been hoping to understand, was slipping through my fingers like water. The passengers were still there. Silent. Unmoving. Their eyes never left the darkened road ahead, as if they were trapped in some kind of hypnotic trance. Or maybe they weren't trapped at all. Maybe they didn't even want to leave. I could feel their eyes on me again, though none of them acknowledged my presence. There was no hostility, no anger, just a hollow, unbearable stillness. And I realized, in that moment, that they had all been here before. They were just like me, once. They had gotten on this bus, too. They had tried to understand. But they were too far gone now, lost to whatever this was, whatever this place had become. I had to get off. I had to escape. The air felt suffocating, the pressure in my chest almost unbearable. My hands shook as I clutched the seat in front of me, willing myself to calm down. I wasn't going to let this drive me mad. I couldn't. But as I looked toward the front of the bus, my eyes caught something I hadn't noticed before. The bus driver. He hadn't moved, but now, there was something different about him. Something dark. I couldn't tear my gaze away. His eyes, once obscured by shadow, were now fully visible, locked on me, their pupils dilated, the whites of his eyes impossibly wide. He stared at me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. And then, just as I thought I might scream, his lips parted, but no words came out. There was no sound. Just a smile. A slow, unnerving smile that spread across his face like a sickness. It wasn't a smile. Not a real one. It was something else, something alien. Something wrong. The bus jolted again, the sharp, violent movement throwing me off balance. My hand instinctively gripped the edge of the seat as I tried to steady myself. My heart pounded in my chest. What was happening? Where were we going? I had to know. I had to understand. I stood up. I didn't think. I didn't plan it. My legs moved on their own, carrying me toward the front of the bus. My mind was clouded with panic, a whirlwind of fear and confusion. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. But I knew I couldn't stay in my seat any longer. I had to find something, anything, that would tell me what was happening. I reached the aisle and started moving past the silent passengers, my breath quick and shallow. They didn't acknowledge me. They didn't even blink. And then I felt it. A chill that went beyond the cold air of the night. It was something deeper, something that crawled under my skin, something that made my spine tighten and my pulse race. The air felt thick, like I was wading through it, each step heavier than the last. I could feel the weight of their eyes on me now, the weight of all those lifeless stares. I reached the front of the bus, my heart racing. The bus driver was still there. Still smiling that horrible, twisted smile. His hands never left the wheel, but I could sense something wrong about him, something unnatural. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was something else. Something that had been wearing his skin for too long. I leaned forward, my voice trembling as I spoke, my eyes locked on his. "Where are we going?" I demanded. The bus driver didn't answer. His smile widened, his eyes never leaving mine. Then, without warning, the lights in the bus flickered, once, twice, and then went out entirely. We were plunged into darkness. Panic surged through me. I reached out, grabbing at the back of the seat, trying to steady myself in the overwhelming blackness. My breathing became erratic as I strained my eyes, trying to see through the pitch-black void. Thud. 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 The sound echoed from somewhere behind me, sharp and rhythmic. I spun around, heart in my throat. The passengers, the silent figures, were moving now. But it wasn't like before. This wasn't a slow, lifeless trance. No, this was something else. They were moving in sync, all of them, their bodies jerking and twitching as if they were marionettes being controlled by some invisible force. The sound of their movement was like nails on a chalkboard, grating and unbearable. I couldn't look away. I was frozen, my body paralyzed by fear, by the sheer unnaturalness of it all. And then, just when I thought I might pass out, the lights flickered back on, blinding me with their harsh fluorescent glow. Everything had changed. The bus was empty. The passengers were gone. The seats were empty. The bus driver, gone. I stood there, trembling, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The bus was still rolling down the road, but it was no longer the same bus. It was something else, something I couldn't explain. The seats were now covered in dust, the air thick with a musty, decaying smell. The windows were cracked, the glass fractured like broken mirrors. I stumbled to the door, my hands shaking as I tried to open it. It wouldn't budge. I slammed my shoulder against it, again and again, but it wouldn't open. Thud. The sound came again. The pounding, the scraping, the endless knocking from somewhere within the walls. It was getting louder, closer, as if something, or someone, was trying to break through. I was trapped. And then, I heard it. A voice. Low. Raspy. Unmistakable. "You're never leaving," it whispered. And in that moment, I understood. The bus wasn't a ride. It wasn't a way home. It was a trap. A place where the lost and the damned were brought to be forgotten. And I had never been meant to leave.